My name is Todd Miranda, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use control templates to alter the look of a control in WPF. Let's begin by creating a new WPF project. We'll create a .NET 3.0 Windows application. Now in WPF we can use styles to alter the look and feel of a particular control. But styles only go so far. They only give us so much power. What if we want to really radically change the look and feel of a control? We can do that with control templates. So let's begin by adding a few elements to our window. And we're going to use a stack panel to do that. And in our stack panel we'll have a text box. And the text box will have some text. We'll say my text. And the text box will have a name so that we can reference it in code. And we'll just call this text for lack of a better name. And we'll go in here and we'll also say text wrapping equals wrap so that we get our text to wrap appropriately. And that should be fine. Maybe we should also go up here and we'll confine this a little bit. So we'll specify the width to be, say, 100 and the height to be, we'll say 50. And below that, in our stack panel, we're going to have a button, and it's going to have a click event. And we'll just call that click event click me. And this button is going to have some content, and the content will be toggle text box. And we'll do a horizontal alignment equals center. And then we'll specify a width and a height on this because we're going to use that a little bit later. So we'll specify a width of, we'll say 75, and a height of 50. Alright, so let's add our click me event to the code behind, and then we'll take a look and see what we've got so far. And this is going to take an object, and we'll call that sender, and it's going to take a routed event args, and we'll call that E. So let's go in here, and really all we're going to do is the text enabled property. We're going to set that to the opposite of what it is. So what we get by doing this is effectively our button becomes a toggle for the is enabled property of our text box. So let's run this and let's see what we've got so far. And that looks good. We've got our text block. It wraps. We've got our button. If we click our button, we disable. If we click it again, we re-enable. Alright, great. So now we know that we can come into our button, and we could come in here, we could specify background, we could specify padding, we could specify a lot of properties and set them inline. Or we also know that we can go to our stack panel and we can do a stack panel.resources and create a resource block, put a little space in there. And we can come into our resource block and we can specify a style. We can specify a target type for our style of button. We could also come in here and just put button here, but to be more proper we'll use the X-type markup syntax, and we'll give this style a name, so we'll call it my button style. Okay, and we see that we can come in here and we can use setters, and we can set the property. We'll set padding, and we can set its value to 3. So we can come in, we can set properties for our button this way. And then we can come down to our button and we specify a style. We can use a static resource, and we can use my button style since we just created that up above there. Okay, so this would give us the capability to change the padding of our button by specifying the value in the style here. But we want to take that to the next level, so we're going to set another property, and the property that we're going to set is the template property. And the template property for our particular button allows us to create a control template and apply that control template to our button to change the look and feel of our button. So let's go in here and set the value to a control template. And that control template's target type is going to be a button, because that's the type of control that this control template is going to be used on. And now we can go into our control template, and here is where we effectively set the look and feel of our control. And we have complete control at this point to change anything that we want to change. So let's just go really crazy, and we're going to go with an ellipse. And maybe we're going to set its fill to blue, and we can set the stroke to red, and the stroke thickness, we'll set stroke thickness to 3. Now we also want to set the height and width of our ellipse. But the idea of a control template is not to completely override everything the user wants to do. We want to give the user the capability to still set some of the properties of our control, but then we're going to take those properties and use them the way that we want to use them. So we want the ellipse, in our case here, to be the same height and width as that height and width is specified in the button to which this style is applied. So the way we do that is a special type of binding syntax called template binding. So we're going to come in here and we're going to set the width of our ellipse to template binding, and the path here is going to be the property of the control to which this control template was applied. And in our case, that's a button, and we want to set the property width. So we're going to template bind, or we're going to bind the width property of the button that this style is applied to, and we're going to apply that to the width of the ellipse that's inside our control template. This is a way that we can utilize the properties that are being set by the user in the control and use them in our own control template. So we'll do the same thing with height, and we'll do template binding, and obviously we're going to bind that to height. Now the one thing to note here is we don't always have to bind property to property, or the same property to the same property. They simply have to be the same type. So the way we're going to display that is we want to set the margin of our ellipse, or we may want to set the padding of our ellipse. We could set the margin of our ellipse to be the value of padding because they use the same type. So we could come in here, we could set that, and we'll do that in just a minute when we come back here and we're going to alter the control, because we're going to set that on a different element of our control. But for now, we have our ellipse, and we have the stroke and the fill and the stroke thickness. We've set the width and height to the same as the button. So at this point, let's stop, let's run it, and let's see what we've got. So here's our form again, except this time we've got this ellipse in the place of where our button was. Now it's still the button. We've just changed the look and feel of it. So if I click, we still get the event fired and our text box gets toggled. Okay? But if I were to go to this form as a user, that's not going to be very intuitive to me that that's a button, because it doesn't behave like a button. So let's include some of the behaviors of a button in our control template. And the way we'll do that is with control template triggers. So we'll create a block of triggers within our control template, and the first trigger that we're going to set, we're going to look at the property is mouse over, and value is true. So when the mouse is over our control, we want to use setters just like we would any other time. We're going to set the property, and we're going to set the property as fill, and in this case we'll set the value to green. Alright, there's another property. We'll set stroke, and the value will be, let's say blue, so we'll just toggle it a little bit. Alright, now we said before that we're going to use, inside this control template, we're going to use an ellipse. What if we had multiple controls inside of our control template? Well, if we had multiple controls, the first thing that we would do is we would use some type of container. In our case, we'll use a grid, and we'll place our ellipse inside of our grid. We know we can do that. And we can place multiple controls inside there now because we've got a content control here that will allow us to place multiple elements inside of it. But once we do something like this, our isMouseOver, when we set the properties here, it's not going to know what element in our control template to set those properties on if we have multiple elements. So let's go into our ellipse and let's give it a name, and we'll just call it ELL for ellipse. Now note that just by setting this name inside a control template, this does not mean that in code behind we'll be able to reference this particular element using ELL. If you do need for some reason to reference the ELL element from your code behind, you can use the find name on the control template. But you would have to actually delve down into the template and use the find name there. It's not going to be recognized at a top level to be able to call ELL directly. Inside the control template, when you specify a name, it's going to be used for this. So we do our setter, we set the property, the value, and then we set target name. And target name is ELL. So this allows us to have multiple elements and be able to target the properties of each of those elements individually in our triggers. So in this case, we're going to specify the target as ELL. We're going to set those things, those properties. Now let's add another trigger block. And this time we're going to do isPressed, because that's another very typical behavior that we see in a button. And originally the fill was blue. We changed it to green on MouseOver. So let's change the fill to red when they press on it, and we'll do a green border. So we'll just kind of swap all these things out based on the behavior. Alright, so we've set all of our triggers now, or we set a couple of our triggers. We could set plenty more of these. You would definitely want to do an isEnabled so that if you disable your text box or your button, you'd be able to see the results of that. So let's run this. And now here's our form back. When we mouse over, we get some reaction, and when we press, we get a reaction as well. So much closer now to actual button behavior because it responds to our mouse, it responds to mouse over and pressed events. But there's one thing that we did not see in our button, and it was our text. Where did our text go? Well, we haven't told the control template where to put the text. And when you override the template of a control, you are overriding pretty much everything as far as the look and feel of that control. So you have to go in and you have to tell the control template where to place the content of the original control. So our button has content. We haven't told the control template where to put that content yet. So since we can have multiple controls, your first instinct might be, well, we could put a text box in here or a text block in here because it's text that we want to get out of our button. And that's true. You could create a text block. You could set its text property to the template binding and bind the content of our button. But it's not always going to be text. What if it's an image or some type of rich media content? So we can use a content control because a content control can contain any type of content. So we'd specify a content control here, template bind its content property to the content property of our button, and that would work fine. However, there's another control that was created just for control templates. You can use it in other places, but its efficiency is set to help control templates, and that is a content presenter control. So we'll use the content presenter control here, and in our case we want to set the horizontal alignment equals center, and we'll go in here, we'll set the vertical alignment also equals center. And we talked about earlier that we could set properties to and template bind them to other types of properties as long as the data type was the same. So we want to set the margin of our content presenter to give a little bit of space between the content and the surrounding element, but we don't want to set it to margin. We'll set it to the padding of our button. So we'll do template binding here just like normal, and we can template bind this to the padding property of the parent control. And that's simply because they use the same data type. So it's the same type of data. So now we've got our content presenter. We've aligned it center, horizontally and vertically. We've given it a little bit of margin here. So the only other thing that we need to do for our content presenter is come in and bind the content to the content of our button, or the control that our content, or the control that we're binding to. In our case, it's a button. We've set that in the target type. Alright, so let's take a look at this and we'll see what this looks like. Now we can see our text is inside our button, and we can click on our button to have the click event fired off. We get our mouse over event, we get our pressed event occur. So you can see that we can radically go in and change the look and feel of a control using control templates. But when we use control templates, we have some responsibility to make sure that we provide the users the same type of behaviors. So we did that here with our property triggers, and also we need to make sure that we respect the content of the original control by using a content presenter and letting the control template know where it's supposed to place that content.